first ever episode of Super Historical. My name is Lucas and I'm a history student at Cardiff University. I'm creating this channel to try and give a fresh approach from a younger perspective on history, as I know from personal experience that teachers and lecturers, they tend to go over concepts and ideas very quickly. They can use really long words sometimes that I know I sometimes don't understand, and they just kind of go into too much detail when explaining like the thoughts in their head, and it really doesn't make it any easier for us younger people to really get into history. So that's why I'm creating this YouTube channel. And in my first ever episode, I'll be covering the concept of modernity, which is actually a lot more complicated than some people may believe. I sure didn't realize how hard it would be to explain the concept of like what modern means. And we just used the word a bit too loosely in history. And even historians nowadays, they debate what exactly modernity means, when did the modern era start. So in this episode, I'll be trying to cover that and hopefully present it in a simple way for you to understand. Okay, let's start off with me asking you what modernity means and what would you consider it to be? Would you say that it's modern to own the latest smartphone or drive a car or to have access to health insurance, to benefits, or maybe you think it's as simple as having access to clean running water from a tap? And if you said yes to those, would your viewpoint change depending on where you live? For example, would a person living in New York City be more modern to someone living in a tribe in Africa, for example? If you said the New York City person, why do you think that? Is it because they have access to a coffee shop? Is it because they have access to the latest Samsung and Apple products? Is it because they can call people in distant parts of the world, whereas someone living in a tribe in Africa wouldn't have the ability to communicate with anyone outside of the locality? So these are all kind of things you have to consider when dealing with historical terms that you think you know really well, but in fact they're actually a lot harder to conceptualize and write about. Mid-20th century philosopher Theodor Adorno argues that modernity is a qualitative, not chronological category, and that modernity can't just be defined as a point in time. For example, we can't just say that the Industrial Revolution is the point that the UK became modern, and we can't simply say that the end of the Second World War or the American Revolution is when the USA became modern. He argues that it would be far simpler and easier to assign measurable criteria to gauge how modern a country is, and some of these criteria I shall be going on to talk to now. Okay, so one of the markers of modernity that we can consider is the level of globalization happening in the country. So that's like how much trade is happening, how much the businesses in that country are interacting with other businesses in other countries. So that means there's more trade, there's more consumer goods, there's more knowledge and technology being distributed around the world. So modernity can kind of be linked to the interconnectedness of the world. So more and more countries and people in certain countries are beginning to dress more like each other than ever before. They're demanding the same products. So people in the USA, people in China, people in the UK, they all want the same smartphones. They're kind of focusing on the same fashion, on the same cars, on the same sports even in some places. And this level of global uniformity, so people acting and wanting the same things, is a good marker and good way to gauge how modern a country is. So if you think about it, North Korea, that could be, some people could consider that country to be not modern, and that's because people aren't allowed to travel there. Goods in North Korea and books and the internet aren't that easily accessible, so people don't really have the opportunities to better expand their knowledge and to become more modernized in tech and just the general information happening in the world. Another great way to measure how modern a country is to look at its levels of commercialization and capitalism. So, for example, nowadays, if you go to a football stadium, you're probably constantly going to see advertising for Red Bull saying Red Bull gives you wings, buy Gatorade, buy Snickers. You'll see Nike and Adidas appearing on um, t-shirts, and that's all part of the development of advertising, which ties into modernity quite well, because 200 years ago, did you really see all this kind of branding and stuff? I probably didn't. If you think about the ancient Olympics, that was more to do with pleasing the gods than anything else. Whereas nowadays, it's more for a monetary prize and glory and, stuff like that as well. But back in the day, it would be more of a holiday, and it'd be seen more as a holy ceremony, whereas nowadays it's quite advertised and monetized. And if you look at Christmas and Easter as well, you'll be able to see sales of Easter eggs, advent calendars. All of that ties into the development of capitalism, which coincides with the growth of modernity already quite well. So coming on to urbanization now as an example of a gauge to see how modern the nation is, we could consider my earlier example of comparing New York City to a remote African tribe. Someone living in New York City, they would have more access to technology, to education, to food, to job opportunities. For example, they could grow up to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a YouTuber, a game designer, whereas someone living in a remote part of the world wouldn't really have those opportunities. They would at best become a hunter, a gatherer, a herbal healer, but they certainly wouldn't have that same levels of opportunity to become whatever they want. And that kind of brings us onto modernity, because in olden times people would live in small rural farms, many of them because they didn't have the technology to be able to harvest as much food necessary for everyone. Whereas now we have combine harvesters, which mean that a few people can plow many acres of fields, and then the people living in the cities will have more than enough food. So then they can concentrate on providing services, consumer goods to the masses living in a small concentrated area. So then that means they'll have higher living standards, they have better job opportunities, and they can grow up to be whatever they want, as compared to smaller rural communities. I think that many of you would also agree that democracy is quite a key feature of a modern country. For example, could you really say that North Korea is a modern country without democracy? Like the people that are unhappy, the poor, low living standards, small education, and that's all because it's run by a tyrannical leader. Whereas in countries like the UK, the USA, you have a figurehead, but he's not the ultimate power. You have a Congress or a parliament, and that way the people living in that country, they know that they can relax, they can feel safe, they know they're not going to have soldiers knocking on the doors, collecting unfair tax, stealing their goods, kicking them out of their homes. So having a centralized, democratized government is certainly something that you look for if you're deciding whether a country or a state is modernized. Okay, now finally moving on to the concepts of rationality and optimism. So by rationality, I mean how likely is someone or like a family of farmers that's suffering from a drought, how likely are they to test the soil, fertilize it, maybe irrigate it? Or are they more likely to perform a ritual to pray to the gods to just like send some water down to fertilize the soil again? And in line of this is someone that gets sick from disease. Are they going to go seek a doctor for treatment to get some antibiotics, or are they going to see it as a punishment from God and pray for a week? So this contrast between traditional ways and modern ways is certainly like a very good way to see how modern the country is. For example, many tribes in the Amazon, they still perform rituals, they still don't have access to antibiotics, so if someone gets sick, they pray, they perform rituals. Whereas someone here in the UK, the USA, Europe, Asia mostly, they'll go and find a doctor and seek medical advice. Now, optimism is also one that you wouldn't really expect. However, C.A. Bailey, a historian, he argues that people that have more of a modern outlook feel like they can change their social status in life, they can find self-improvement. So, for example, if someone is poor nowadays, they don't really believe that they'll always stay poor. They can always find a career opportunity. They can become a singer, they can go on X Factor, they can start a waffle shop, which can become a franchise, like the guy from KFC did. He was like 55, he just started like a waffle truck, and now look what KFC is. So the opportunities for poorer people to become richer, to change the social status and labels, that's all associated with modernity. Because people in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, especially like peasants and farmers, if you were born a peasant, you'd most likely stay a peasant for most of your life, as the hierarchical system back then would pretty much bog you down and make sure you could never escape that bubble of just peasantry. So now moving on to the conclusion. But just before, we should look at the words of Karl Gluck, who argues that modernity is very much a product of a country's ability to improvise. For example, if you look at the UK during the Industrial Revolution, they had a lot of coal, so naturally you had people working on steam engines, refining designs of them, making trains go faster. And if someone was to design you a wind turbine that could give you a bit of power, that would not be anywhere near as much appreciated as it would be 20 years ago, when we start suffering like a renewable energy crisis. So that goes to show that modernity is really not a set in stone kind of concept, but it's very fluid, and I'm sure that people in the 1900s thought that they were very modern, and we right now think we're really modern, and that idea is going to change in 100 years. So at best, we all have to make up our own minds based on these kind of parameters of modernity as to what we believe it is. And that's really the best conclusion I can give you. So if you have any suggestions for future videos, please put them in the comments. Also, if there's anything I could have done better, put that in the comments as well. But if not, please like and subscribe, and I'll bring another video in 2 weeks' time.